Welcome back. Today we are looking at Chapter 4 of the textbook, and for those of you that don't have a textbook or those of you that would rather I just highlight some key points of the textbook, this is meant to be a summary of Chapter 4. So Chapter 4 is really about the flaws of classical liberalism, mostly economically, and more importantly, the responses to those. So the title is Responding to Classical Liberalism, and it begins with some criticisms of classical liberalism. So when I guide my students through this chapter, I suggest for my students to create a chart. And for the chart, they should keep a track of the individuals and groups and what is their complaint with classic liberalism, and perhaps what is their solution. And through this, we'll better understand ideologies and we'll better understand individualism, collectivism, and the evolution of liberalism. So, for example, the chapter begins by looking at groups of children called hurriers. And these hurriers were child workers who worked in mines, and the conditions that they worked in hindsight were quite not only exploitive but inhumane due to how crowded they were. They couldn't stand up due to the long hours, due to the presence of poison gas. These are dangerous conditions, and children not being able to go to school, young children, 6, 7, 8 years old, are subject to this cruel and inhumane working conditions. So one criticism of classic liberalism would be that it was exploitive of children. So a solution, if you are a Chartist, would be that government, through legislation, can regulate that flaw of human nature and create laws that will limit the age of children. So if they create legislation that makes it illegal for children under the age of 10 to work, then the flaw has been addressed. So if you are a Chartist, you don't think that liberalism needs to be completely abolished. You're not looking at completely changing liberalism and rejecting it to the extent of creating a non-liberal economy. What you're saying is we can reform it. There's a flaw there, there's exploitation, but Chartists believe that the solution lies within government and the ability to create legislation to protect those who are being exploited, because by nature we are exploitive people, so government can regulate our nature. Whereas if you are a Marxist, you might look at a similar scenario and say, what is happening to the children as these hurriers is happening to the workers in general, that the workers of the world are being exploited. And they're being exploited because history is a history of class struggle between the haves and have-nots. And in Marx's day, it was between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And he argued that eventually those being oppressed, the proletariat, the workers, would have an epiphany. They'd have an awakening where they realize we're being oppressed. But it won't be the government that will provide the solution. It'll be the workers. They will break off the chains of oppression. They will use violence to seize the means of production. And as they seize the means of production, those factories, they'll inspire other proletariat workers, other proletarians in other factories to do the same. And we'll have a civil war between the interests of the bourgeoisie, the robber barons, the nouveau riche, the capitalists, against the workers. And because the workers now control the factories, they'll win the civil war, and they'll be able to create a paradigm shift towards collectivism. The paradigm shift will need a re-education of the people. So in order to fulfill a re-education, the workers must create a dictatorship of the proletariat, and they will re-educate, repurpose society to live under the maxim from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's collective instead of self-interest. So that's another example of a flaw of classic liberalism inspiring change. To the Chartists, it was just a reform that was needed. To a Marxist, it was more than a reform, it was a revolution that was needed. So classic liberalism has led to abuse of things like children. And how you respond to that abuse will reflect your ideologies. Now, Luddites are another group of people who looked at classic liberalism and saw a flaw. And their flaw was similar to what Marx was saying, is that the value of labor was being diminished. But Luddites, their target of aggression wasn't the capitalist as much as the machines that they believed were replacing the workers. So Luddites, in a reactionary way, they're trying to go back to recreate a pre-industrial society where instead of machines you had skilled artisans, doing things by hand. So Luddites would be reactionary. They're trying to recreate a glorious past, whereas those Marxists, they were trying to create something new, a paradigm shift towards egalitarianism, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. This idea of this paradigm shift that had a dictatorship of the proletariat, they had never had that before. That was a radical thing. So a difference between the Marxists and the Luddites show a difference between radicals and reactionaries, both willing to use violence, both committed to change, but in which direction do you want to change? Luddites want to go back and uninvent, if you will, the machines, attack those machines, and go back to the idea of skilled artisans creating the work, and whereas communists believe that, and Marxists believe that, in order to address the real root of the problem here, which is exploitation and inequality, we need to do something new. We need to do something new. Now, Marxists are a group, a subgroup of a larger group called socialism. And socialists generally believe in economic collectivism. So economic collectivism would be we need to cooperate, we have a common good, we have a collective responsibility. But where Marxists differ from socialists in general is Marxists had a different path to the same end goal. The same end goal is utopia. And utopia would be defined in their eyes by egalitarianism, an end to poverty, an end to inequality. But communists felt the only road to achieve that would be through violence, because those committed to the current system wouldn't be willing to give up their power without a violent revolution. Whereas other socialists felt that there was ways to do it non-violently. So they share the same goal. Let's create a system based on egalitarianism, common good, collective interest, public property. But how do we get there? What's the means to that end? Marx said violence will be necessary. Men like Robert Owen said that we can do this in a non-violent way. So who was Robert Owen? Robert Owen was a factory owner who was inspired to use the profit and the revenue generated by his factory town to improve the conditions, the working and the living conditions of his employees. So he created a model town called New Lanark in Scotland, and it was meant to show how wealth could, instead of being funneled into the hands of the robber barons, which Owen could have been as the factory owner, could be redistributed back to the workers. And in his factory town, Robert Owen gave out public education. He had leisure time for his workers. He had holidays for his workers. He created laws that children under the age of 10 couldn't work, or they would work shorter work days than the rest of people. So at 10 years of age, they could work 10-hour days, which is shorter than 13-hour days. So even a 10-hour day for 10-year-olds is still not ideal, but it's better than what was happening elsewhere. In Robert Owen's New Lanark, his commitment was to ensure that it wasn't just him that was benefiting, but the benefits of the industrial process was being shared. So there should be reasonable prices for the commodities at the company stores. The rent should be affordable for the housing that the workers were renting from the factory, from the company. He wanted to ensure that there would be cooperation between management and labor to provide work safety. And it was a paradigm. It was a revolution. This had not been done. This is why New Lanark is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, because it was such a visionary thing to try to accomplish. So Robert Owen is a utopian socialist. He tries to create utopia. He tries to create paradise here on earth. Karl Marx believes that that's only possible. The same kind of goal is only possible through violence. Chartists believe that we share the same problem. There's exploitation. They all agreed that they saw exploitation in classical liberalism, but Chartists believe that, a democratically elected government can provide the solution. So some interesting differences, but also interesting similarities. Another group that we encounter is classic conservatism. And classic conservatives like Edmund Burke, he's not really responding to the flaws of economic liberalism. He's responding to the flaws of political and social liberalism. We've already talked about Burke to some extent, and there's lots of good ways to really summarize Burke's ideology. And I like using this idea of Burke's, that we are part of a great chain of being, that we are here today. The life that we get to enjoy today is only made possible by the work of our ancestors. And for us to deviate from their values, from their norms so quickly that we destroy their legacy is basically it's violating that chain. It's breaking the great chain of being. And therefore we have a commitment to honor our ancestors by making sure that our change isn't so radical, so progressive, so sudden that we abandon our traditions, our norms, our values that have allowed us to enjoy this life today. So Burke was more, conservative. He liked the status quo, and when he saw things like the French Revolution, he looked into the revolution and he saw that by allowing for that sudden radical progress, it only unleashed the worst of mankind. So he wanted stability over liberty. He liked a stable government, right? Now, the chapter begins to introduce some other concepts, some concepts that we're going to see again in chapter 6. I don't know why they split them between two chapters. That's why the textbook does have flaws. And the next concept is the idea of the progressive era. So now that we have individuals like Karl Marx, like Robert Owen, like Neil Ludd, and others seeing flaws within liberalism, it's natural that a group of people will try to respond to those flaws. And as we know, liberalism is an evolving ideology, and try to create a new version of liberalism that has responded to, that has addressed those flaws. That's why we end up seeing a change from classic to modern liberalism. Classic liberalism, modern liberalism. So what's the difference? Classic liberalism is this idea, like laissez-faire capitalism, freedom from government. Like, how can I have a good life? I need government to keep out of my economic activities. Freedom from government. The best way for me to have a healthy, successful, fulfilling economic life is for the government to get out of my way. Right? Freedom from government. Whereas modern liberals might say that there's times where we need freedom through government, that the marketplace needs to be policed, that there needs to be regulations to protect workers. We need regulations to protect consumers. We need regulations to monitor, respond to, and somehow limit sometimes the flaws of mankind in our nature. So we have this evolution from classic to modern liberalism, from freedom from government to freedom through government. And that transition begins with this progressive era. And in the textbook, they talk about presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, who is seen as a progressive because he sees the need for change. Historically, at that point, the governments in countries like America, the government really responded to the wishes of the capitalists, and therefore they didn't represent the interests of the workers. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to represent the interests of both, the workers and the capitalists. So Marx believed that the government would not respond to the conflict between these two groups because the government was compromised by the worker or by the capitalists. Where Teddy Roosevelt shows that there are some politicians that try to hear both or balance both perspectives. So he creates something called the square deal. This idea that we're going to have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the capitalists and the workers, both sit down as equals at a table and address their concerns about labor and manufacturing. And therefore, when workers went on strike under Teddy Roosevelt, unlike previous presidents that would use the military to break up the strike and force them back to work, he used the government to protect their right to strike. So that is progress. That's a change. we will have an entire lesson on this progressive era, and in the progressive era, we'll see a movement towards, women getting the right to vote, and this changing idea of one of the themes of ideology is identity, right? Is gender, and we're going to see the redefining of gender roles in society as suffragettes challenge the monopoly that men had on politics, and they demand the right to vote. Also within this time period, you're going to see the growth of something called the welfare state. And this is the idea that we get freedom through government. So the government may need to respond to challenges that individuals are facing by providing things like minimum wage or insured housing. They may provide things like food stamps, or they might regulate the price of certain essentials. So one thing that we're going to do in the future is look at, what elements of the economy warrant government intervention. What is so essential that the government must intervene. So the end of chapter 4 introduces the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes looks at the idea of fiscal and monetary policy. Fiscal policy and monetary policy are key to understand modern liberalism. Fiscal and monetary policy would be this idea of how do we shape an economy when it begins to struggle? So do we shape it by taxing during good times and then spending that money in bad times? That's fiscal policy. That's Keynes saying the government has a role to limit how quickly the economy is booming, to slow that boom down so it's sustainable, but also intervene during the bad times so that there's not too much despair. So Keynesian fiscal policy will be one of the responses to the Great Depression and really will announce the beginning of modern liberalism. We also see monetary policy, which is trying to manipulate interest rates to bring about changes to the economy. And that, my friends, is an introduction to chapter 4. And that is the main focus today.